Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be picking up pretty much after the Second World War. We're going to be talking a little bit about what was going on during that skirmish. I guess it's not a skirmish, it's a massive, massive thing. So I guess one thing I want to say is that the First World War and the Second World War are very different things. Culturally, they're very different. The First World War was very European. The Second World War was much more global. The First World War, we went into it with one idea of how it was going to shake out. With the Second World War, it was a completely different rhetoric. And I'm not going to go that much into war history because we have a lot of stuff to get through. But what I will say is that in the First World War, you had this moment in Zurich called Dada that was new and historical and this great pinpoint of information and cultural development. Whereas in the Second World War, it was much more of a diaspora. And that's a term that some of you might know, some of you might not know, but basically when people are pushed from one area into a variety of different other areas, such as refugees, that's what's referred to as a diaspora. It's the people disperse. And so in the build-up to the Second World War, Europeans dispersed. A lot of them came over to the United States and had massive aesthetic repercussions to that end, but some of them did stay behind. And so what we're going to see in today's lecture is artwork from around the Second World War that was influenced by this diaspora, this moving around of an intellectual set. So previously we talked about the avant-garde. Well, imagine if that avant-garde, instead of being located in like Paris or Dresden or Zurich, there's a guy in Dresden, there's a guy in New York, there's a guy in Connecticut, there's a guy in Paris, there's a gal in London, there's a gal in Berlin. It's all over the place, and they're writing letters to each other, they're engaging with each other, and so really for the first time what we're going to tip into is a much more global conversation that spans oceans and that gives us a lot of very similar art, or art dealing with similar ideas in a lot of different places, which for our purposes means that we have a lot of different perspectives on stuff. So to start off really quickly, we have two pictures here. Both are from 1939. On the right-hand side, we have a Dada collage from Berlin Dadaist John Hartfeld. And on the left-hand side, we have a painting by Thomas Hart Benton, who is an American regionalist painter. And I didn't talk that much about the regionalists because we don't have that much time in our course, but Thomas Hart Benton was very influential for the set of young painters in the United States. John Hartfeld was very influential for artists in Europe. Even though these two images look very, very different, they actually are the kind of aesthetic root of what we're going to be talking about today. So we have Dada and then this kind of like big, almost mural style narrative painting about American heroism. All right, really quickly, before we start talking about what happened in Europe, I want to give you this term. It's actually two terms that generally mean the same thing. They're kind of interchangeable. Art informel and art autre. Basically, that means other art. This term regards post-war French art that deals with tachisme, and the definition for tachisme is below here, which is specifically a type of abstract painting. So tachisme is a method for making a painting. Art informel is a method for thinking about the production of a painting. So art informel is the theory, tachisme is the physical action. Order implies restriction from all possible materials a limited selection has been made, and from all possible relations, a limited set has been used. So disorder, by implication, is unlimited. No pattern has been realized, but its potential for patterning is indefinite. This is why, though we seek to create order, we do not simply condemn disorder. We recognize that this is destructive to the existing pattern. Also, that it has potentiality. It symbolizes both danger and power. So in 1966, after this time period, Mary Douglas is writing reflectively on the time period that we're talking about today. So what happened, as we get to this another world war, a lot of people realize that disorder seemed to be as much of a mainstay in the natural world as order. You can't have one without the other. And so a lot of the artwork that we're going to see deals with a kind of abstract painting that privileges disorder, but does so because it understands that it's kind of like a pendulum swinging back and forth, where on one side you have order, one side you have disorder, but they're equally part of the system. And so we're going to see a kind of abstract painting that develops that seems disorderly, but is actually part of or considers the general order of things. Starting off with our pictures today is Jean Fautrier. Excuse me. He's a French painter who during the war, and you can see the dates of this painting actually coincide with the last few years of the war. During the war, Jean Fautrier was a refugee. He was hiding. And at one point he was situated in a place that had him very near to, I don't want to say it was a concentration camp, because the idea of being near a concentration camp is impossible, but he was near a holding cell for people who were on their way to concentration camps. And so what this work is, and there's a whole series of them, tête d'otage, that translates into head of a hostage. So Fautrier is in one building, and he's hiding out, so he can't make a sound, he can't do anything, he's just like really has to keep a low profile. And in the building next door, he can hear the horrors that are being inflicted upon the hostages that have been taken by the other side, the side with the Nazis. And so he begins to use whatever material he can get his hands on. He can't go to an art store because he has to keep a low profile. He constantly wants to make art because that's what artists do. And so he just grabs at anything he can and begins to make these vague likenesses of the people that he's perceiving are on the other side. And so we have no discernible facial features, save for this nose, this eyebrow, a chin here. But outside of those very generalized human features, we don't have anything that we can actually use as kind of a standard portrait. You can't hold this up to someone and say, oh yeah, it looks like you. Because it's not about what they look like, it's about the psychological underpinnings of what they're going through. For Fautrier, it's more interesting, it's more important that he actually conveys a sense of psychological reality. Now this might be similar to the ideas we talked about, or should be similar to the ideas we talked about when we dealt with surrealism. This sense of making a painting that was about an interior perspective. Well, the surrealists were really wrapped up in their own introspection. But Fautrier and other artists associated with art informel are much more interested in a broader psychological introspection. What's going on in our world is defined by what's going on in all of our heads. Just to give you a name, Roberto Matta, The Vertigo of Eros from 1944. This work, as some of you might see very clearly in its aesthetics, comes out of the surrealism of, let's say, anybody? Paul Klee. The kind of, I think it's kind of like Paul Klee and Yves Tanguy, but that's just me. You have this kind of ethereal, spatial relationship, but also a lot of automatic drawing. Matta uses a lot of automatism in his work, and he also employs a lot of psychological introspection. The distinction here is that Matta is not, like Fautrier, concerned with a broader sense of psychological awareness. Instead, he is kind of a classic surrealist. He's concerned with his own perspectives. Matta is going to emigrate from Europe to the United States before the end of the war. And he's going to take this specific kind of late surrealist ideology and bring it to the artists working in the United States. That's going to become a lot more clear as we move forward, but I just want to fit him into the timeline of Europe. Wolfgang Schultz, otherwise known as Walls, gives us Oui, 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 or Yes, Yes, Yes. This work was made right after the armistice, right after the war had ended, when the full reality of the mess we had made was clear. You know, by this point, nuclear bombs had been set off in an act of aggression against the nation of Japan. And Walls was not happy. He was a man who was very, very scarred by what he saw and what he understood to be happening during that conflict. And so in this work, like many other works, he creates these paintings that almost appear to be wounds. This is a scar on the body of humanity. This is what people were thinking. This is the broader psychological malaise, as it were, that people were feeling during this time. So, if Walls presents this like really brooding, sad, angsty, all those things, Jean Dubuffet gives us the other side of the perspective. Jean Dubuffet was not a professional painter by trade. After the war, he began to pick up the craft and make things similar to this. Apartment Houses, Paris, 1946. Now, it's a pretty standard image. He is trying to capture a variety of different buildings in downtown Paris as they exist after the war in 1946. So the Nazis have left, and the French are there to clean up the mess. And what happens is, 1944, no one's on the streets of Paris. 1946, people return. That's what happens when war is over. You just have to get back to life. You have to open your business. You have to sweep up the streets. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. Walls, the previous artist, would have opted for the not getting anywhere. He was he was a very emotionally unstable man, and so the war greatly affected him. Dubuffet, on the other hand, understood this idea that we have to clean it up. We have to go through the streets, pick up our trash, and just get it out of the way. But he was also very interested in the way that people presented or the world that we had around us. And so in this image, he's giving us this rendering of a very standard Paris block where you can see a variety of different people littering the streets, and you can see some of them in the window. It almost looks a little bit like an advent calendar from around the Christmas time, where behind every window you see a person. And what Dubuffet is saying there is that not all of us left Paris. There's still a population of people here. We just haven't seen them because they've been hiding in these apartments. But now that the storm has passed, They are coming out and they're experiencing their world again. The one thing about this work that is so striking is that Paris is known for being a white city. Not necessarily the population, but the buildings. If you go to Paris, there's a very, very strict building code that requires that all buildings be built roughly to the same height. Here we have about 6 stories per building, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a garret apartment generally. So like 4 to 5, maybe 6 with this slender apartment in the attic. So all the buildings have to be built the same size. All the buildings have to be white on the street. And what that means is that, as the sun sets in Paris, it's really romantic because all of the buildings cast this glow of the sun. It's wonderful and beautiful and blah, blah, blah. But 1946, Dubuffet is giving us a little bit of Parisian realness with this likeness of a dirty, bomb-ridden city post-war Paris. Paris is not white right now in 1946. Paris is covered in dirt. Seems pretty surprising that immediately following a work like Jean Dubuffet, we have a work by Edoardo Palazzi. Now, Edoardo Palazzi, here I Was a Rich Man's Plaything from 1947, was, as his name suggests, he was an Italian, or of Italian descent, but his family emigrated to London. I don't know if it happened during the war, but by 1947, Edoardo Palazzi was firmly situated within the artistic set of the British capital. He and other people, loosely referred to as the independent group, began exploring the variety of, for lack of a better word, the garbage that was left after the war. And one of the things that Palazzi began toying with were the published materials that were distributed to the GIs in Europe, and also the things that America was producing and sending over. So it was kind of these two things where one box was specifically designed to go to the GIs and to entertain the GIs, and the other box was sent to sell to the people in the countryside. And this is where we see the rise of Coca-Cola as a global brand. We see the rise of America as a global brand, quite honestly. And so what Palazzi does, along with others of the independent group, is he kind of picks up where Dada left off, and this idea of collage as an ability to make a social commentary. So think of that John Hartfeld image of Hitler that I showed you at the very beginning of today's lecture. That, like, say, Hannah Hawks cut with the kitchen knife, is a collage that's used specifically to say something about the culture in which it was made. And so where Hannah Hawk was using imagery from industrial magazines to talk about the industrialization of the world, Palazzi is using advertising material specifically to comment on the way that advertising and consumerism is rising. We are becoming a consumer society, and by 1947, that is very, very clear. Now, in this work, to do a quick walkthrough of its structure, I want to talk to you about how he built this collage. So, it's titled I Was a Rich Man's Plaything, and that title exists right here, as some of you may have seen. I was a rich man's plaything, ex-mistress, I confess, if this he sin, woman of the streets, daughter of sin. If this be sin, excuse me. So, this is the cover of a pulp book. This book would have been tantamount to pornography, it would have been dirty stories, and it would have been basically sold in seedy bookstores. And so Palazzi finds a copy of this, and then, excuse me, and rips the cover off and puts it on this page. He then applies three things to this. The first is right here with a piece of an advertisement of a hand holding a gun, releasing a sound bubble or an onomatopoeia bubble saying "pop." Quite honestly, this is where the term pop art comes from. We'll talk about that next week. He applies this, a piece of cherry pie, also cut from an advertisement, and he applies this, real gold, also pulled from an advertisement. Now at the bottom of the frame, he has "Keep 'em Flying," which is a reference to a military air sortie, and then also a Coca-Cola advertisement. So 1947, Paolozzi identifies Coca-Cola as a dominant global brand. He identifies the idea of the American military as being part of this new landscape. Basically, the American military had very, very little interactions with the world before this skirmish, and all of a sudden, there's American GIs everywhere in Europe. They're in Germany, they're in Paris, they're in London, they're in Italy, they're in North Africa. Some of you might know, but basically, Americans went everywhere to help out in the war effort. At the end of the war, some of you might know this, but I doubt all of you do, a lot of American GIs just were left as peacekeeping operatives in these landscapes. But unlike the peacekeeping operatives that we have today, where we have soldiers still serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, although there's not that many in Iraq, there are still some. There are more in Afghanistan, there's some all over the world. These GIs actually had it kind of made. There's this old adage that comes from Europe that refers to the GIs as overpaid, oversexed, and over there. Well, actually, that's the American translation. The European translation is over here, right? Because the GIs are getting a lot of money from the U.S. government to be these peacekeeping operatives. But there's not Nazi soldiers all over the place, and so there isn't that much peacekeeping that they need to do. It's not like today, where in Afghanistan you have soldiers that readily deal with armed skirmishes. Instead, you had a lot of GIs who were basically living in, say, the area surrounding Milan, and all they were doing was getting these checks and having a good time. They were drinking coffee, they were relaxing, they were peacekeeping. They were helping to rebuild Europe. I don't want to undercut their relationship to the war effort, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit more perspective. What we understand as the plight of our soldiers today was not the same thing as what was going on in the 1940s. So, all of this is really an explanation on this lower image of the keep them flying. This idea that keep them flying, keep them over there, keep putting money into this peacekeeping operation was important to the American military, and it was noticed by Eduardo Paolozzi. So that's the bottom register. The middle bit here, and this is going to make a lot of sense, especially when we start talking about pop art next week, is the way that Paolozzi plays with visual puns. The proximity of, say, a slice of cherry pie near the genitals of a female, scantily clad female, who is claiming all of this. Sorry, brief interruption. So, the cherry pie near this woman, Paolozzi is specifically saying that this woman is a piece of cherry pie. That's explicit, yes, I understand that, but so is the inclusion of the cover of a pulp novel. And we have, the reference to pop is actually just quite specifically a reference to popular culture. So, phew, that's how you unpack something like this. That's how you break down these different images to get a certain sense of what the artist is saying about the world around them based on the images they pull from that world around them. Oops, skipped one. This is another of Edoardo Palazzi's collages from the same time period, 1948, this one, and I just want you to look at this one. And, well, I can just say straight up that if we just spent all that time talking about Edoardo Palazzi's collage, there's a very good likelihood that this or some other collage is going to make its way onto our final examination. So just putting that out there. Okay, so back in the continent of Europe, this is happening in Paris, we have Pierre Solage. Pierre Solage in 1948 was a little less emotionally perturbed than, say, Jean Fautrier or Wolfgang Schultz. He is really engaged with this idea that, you know, after the war, there needs to be a certain sense or a certain privileging of the individual. This privileging of the individual is something that is going to rise very, very quickly in the United States. But in Europe, it takes shape a little more slowly. And what I'm getting at here when I say the rise of the individual is that artists, they see abstraction as this possibility for conveying a broader psychological reality for the people within their community. But to convey that sense of a broader psychological reality, a lot of these artists pick one element or one specific gesture that they will repeat over and over again as a way of like creating a certain level of calm amongst the breadth of their cultural production, but also a certain sense of the recognizable. They want to be the ones who said this. They want to be the ones who not necessarily get famous for it, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. They want to be responsible for making these aesthetic decisions. And this is what Pierre Solage's paintings looked like in 1948, 1949. Now, this timeline, this chronology is going to overlap exactly with what we cover in the United States. And you're going to see work that looks a lot like this. That is not by chance. These artists were international. This conversation was international. Lucio Fontana, his signature gesture was the slicing of canvases. He basically saw the flat surface of a canvas as being really limiting. You know, for hundreds of years, painters had built images onto those canvases as a way of conveying a sense of pictorial depth, as we saw when we talked about perspective. They wanted to give you a sense of a real world or a fictitious world, as we saw with our looking at people like Paul Cézanne, Georges-Pierre Seurat, and other people who dealt with the idea of Arcadia. But Fontana saw another possibility. What's happening behind the canvas? If a canvas is really a quote-unquote picture into another world, then what happens when you slice the canvas and show us what's behind there? Often, because the way that canvases are hung on the walls, there's not that much light that can seep in behind the frame, and so when hanging something like this on your wall, you actually do have nothing but a void, this depth that you can't see the wall behind it. Oftentimes, I've only actually seen one of these things installed where you could see the wall behind it. I've seen quite a few of them installed. They're very popular, and so they are very successful, and they do give you a sense that there is much more than just a white wall behind them. Alberto Burri went through the Italian landscape and collected scraps of materials in the same way that Eduardo Palazzi did, but where Palazzi was drawn to imagery, Burri was drawn to materiality. And so he took all of these different patches of things, stitched them together in something that would roughly be the shape of a canvas, and then applied some very tiny things to it. So you can see on the list down at the bottom, there's oil paints, mechanics oil, gold paint, red paint, glue on burlap and canvas. I didn't mention the red paint, but this is red paint, this is oil, this is gold, and all of those things are things that the artist has applied late to after he's sewn them together. So where Palazzi, the arrangement of things was enough to convey his idea, Burri wanted to give his own opinion in this matter, and so he brings all this detritus into his studio, stitches it together, but then decides he wants to add a little bit of his own moments, and that's why he adds those other things. All right. So that was really briefly walking us through the stuff that was developing around Europe at that time. We have Eduardo Palazzi and the International Group in London. We have Pierre Solage, Jean Fautrier, and Wolfgang Schultz, all in Paris at the time, dealing more specifically with the idea of art informal. And then we have Alberto Burri in Italy. There's a lot more artists working, but those are the ones I decided to talk about. In America, everything is going to change really drastically because, where in our previous conversation about American art, there was this really slow, they were slow to develop. They came late to a lot of the games. Like, they were at Impressionism a little bit late. They were at Realism a little bit late. But because of the war and because of the diaspora of the intellectuals, they're not late to the game when it comes to abstraction, specifically the kind of abstraction we're talking about, the kind of broad social abstraction, or abstraction based on broad psychological realities, but narrowed down to one specific gesture by an artist. And so the Americans really kind of win this round, and this is where you see America becoming not only a geopolitical superpower, but also an artistic superpower. And some of these names are probably going to be familiar to you. All right, really quickly, I just wanted to introduce you to two guys who are important around this time, art critics, two of them. This one's Clement Greenberg. He was very, very interested in the way that artists were addressing the formal realities of their canvases. So he talks in the same way that I've talked a lot about a canvas being a flat surface with pigment and oil and loosely put together to make the idea of an image. All of that stuff comes out of this guy's thinking. That's his arena. Here are a few quotes from his work. Modernism, the use of a characteristic methods of a discipline to criticize the discipline itself. So in other words, a painting is using its flatness to talk about the idea of a painting, or to criticize the thing. The task of self-criticism became to eliminate from the effects of each art and every effect that might conceivably be borrowed from or by the medium of any other art. Basically, what that boils down to is painting is about painting, sculpture is about sculpture. Those two things should not be together. Then there's a few more things, but I'll let you go through that at your own time. Oops. So this guy is Harold Rosenberg. I'm sorry, his name's cut off a little bit, but Harold Rosenberg. For him, he's coming to the game a little later. Greenberg is writing about artwork that was created before and during the war, and he's really aligning with a specific kind of European thinking. Rosenberg is coming to the game after the war. And so he's going into these artist studios, he's seeing them make these grand gestures, these specific gestures in their studio, and he begins to refer to the idea of the artist as an actor. And his terminology is action painting. And so the canvas becomes this arena that the artist engages with and toys with. And the painting, the finished thing, is merely a record of the actions of that painter in that space. So quite literally, for Rosenberg, imagine a football field and one football player. That football player runs all over the field. You know, obviously there's other people on the field during a game, but if we're following just one guy, and he's running all over the place. That's where Rosenberg gets this idea. Because if you translate the idea from a football field to a canvas, and that one football player to one painter, the painter is kind of moving all over the canvas and creating a record of that movement. Action painting. All right, this is a really simple little slide that I like to show to convey a sense of where we are. I'm not going to go through this that specifically, but I will say that this poster was presented or published specifically for the Museum of Modern Art, where the man who wrote it, Alfred Barr, was the director. Now, in 1929, when the museum opened, he was instrumental in the same way that Alfred Stieglitz was years prior to bringing European abstraction and European art over. So where Stieglitz was showing the work of the avant-garde in the 19 teens in the 291 gallery, MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art, is showing that work in the 1920s, 1930s. Now really quickly, that museum also begins to show the work of newer artists in and around New York. And those people are the people we're going to talk about right now. Maybe not right now. Really quickly, Black Mountain College is crazy. I just want you guys to know that name. Black Mountain College was this kind of like, when a lot of the intelligentsia came over from Europe, a few of them began teaching at Black Mountain College. A few of them began teaching in the Art Students League in New York City. And those two places are seen historically as very, very important to the development of American art. Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller. He was teaching at Black Mountain College. He was this crazy thinker, and he's important. He's a name that comes up a lot when dealing with this period of art, and so I just want you guys to know these names. His legacy is very broadly felt, and so I'm not going to go into him that much. All right, now, one of the other influences on American art was Surrealism. Surrealism, the idea of subconscious art making. Remember what I said when I was talking about art informal and Jean Fautrier, this idea that Surrealism is about somebody looking inside themselves to see themselves more clearly. It's very Freudian, it's very psychoanalytic. The influence of Surrealism, however, is much more expansive, it's broader, it has much more to do with everyone's perspective, the collective unconscious. So it's a little bit, for those of you who are studying psychology, it's a flip from Freud to Jung. And here are just two images that I showed you. One has no under it, the other has yes under it. Why? Exquisite Corpse, the image that's on the left-hand side, is a collective art-making game. Andre Masson's Battle of Fishes on the right is an individual at work in his studio and also at work in his mind. He's employing automatism by himself to make an artwork that he is authoring by himself. Exquisite Corpse is about a community. American art at this time is not about collective art making. It is about individual art making. So that's why the Exquisite Corpse was not something that the Surrealists, not one way that the Surrealists influenced American art, but paintings like this, Andre Masson's Battle of Fishes, is. Now, I didn't really talk all that much about neoplasticism before, so I just want to give you a bit of an understanding. So in painting neoplasticism in painting influenced a formal, heavy ideology. So the idea that this painting by Piet Mondrian, that I'm not giving you any information on, so it's not going to be on any exam, this painting is about the limitations of working in a two-dimensional realm. It's about the angles of the stretcher bars. It's about the elimination of the idea of color. So it's black and white. It's only right angles. It's only straight lines. This is going to have a big impact on American art. And one more influence. There's a lot of influences right now. We have Hans Hofmann. Hans Hofmann was one of those expats. He came over from Europe and he began teaching at the Art Students League in New York, and then eventually moved up to Connecticut, where Provincetown, and then later Connecticut. So he taught a lot of people in the United States. And he was privileging this kind of abstraction, which a lot of people say, like, oh, that's silly, my kid could have done that, right? What I can say as someone who's been looking at a lot of art for the last 16 years of my life, or 20 years of my life, is that when I hear people say a kid could do that, all that makes me think is that the person who said that is not thinking hard enough or not looking hard enough at what's in front of them. So look really, really, really closely at this painting. Do you really, really think that a kid could have done this? If the answer is yes, you're not looking hard enough. Think about the way that the paint in the background of this painting has been applied to the canvas. There's a brush. An artist used a brush to make a field of color in the background, right? Yes, a kid could probably have done that. A kid could probably have splattered some paint on a piece of paper. Sure. Hans Hofmann did not just splatter paint on the canvas. He very deliberately put the right amount of paint on his brush and then looked specifically at the white marks, trailed white paint all over the surface of the canvas in very specific ways. This area right here, there's a flat piece of black paint that's been applied to the canvas. But you can see, because of these lines here and here, that the paint has dripped down. So, okay, he's turning the canvas now. He's manipulating the way the canvas is oriented. But look then now at the white that's forming the outside circle. That drip, that splatter that just a 3-year-old could have done, very, very, very delicately goes around the edge here to finally drip right there. We have another drip here that encircles this little yellow dot. Now, one thing Hans Hofmann would have been into is the idea that this looks like a painting that was done very freely, like a child would have done it. But he's bringing a lot more technical ingenuity into this than you want to give him credit for if you're one of those people that says a kid could have done that. Now we're going to look at a lot of paintings that look like this week. And what I want you to do, instead of saying a kid could have done that, is think Why is it important that I'm looking at this? Why does this matter? You're all in a class that is designed to get you to understand why these works matter. And you are not getting out of the class what you should be getting out of the class if you don't give yourself the time to actually look at these things. I will totally agree that this work is easily dismissible. But what I will not take is any one of you ever saying that a kid could have done this. It's just not how it works. Joseph Albers, he's one of the guys I talked to you about who was a teacher at Bauhaus. He was a teacher at Black Mountain College as well. Here are some later prints that he was doing inside the United States. And here are two Hans Hofmanns. And this Fantasia on the side here is, I think, a better indication of this. A kid could not have done this, because not only is there no splatter marks in this work, but it's incredibly delicate and incredibly difficult to get a painting to look this chaotic, but also this cohesive. Just food for thought. All right, 1943, we have Jackson Pollock, and here we have his Guardians of the Secret. Jackson Pollock was interested in automatic mark making. He was taught by Mata. He was taught by other painters as well, including Thomas Hart Benton, and tangentially he got some lessons from Hans Hofmann as well. This is an early work by him, and in this work you can see down on the bottom there's a dog here, there's a deity here, a deity here, and then all of these various small symbols around. The Guardians of the Secret implies the Guardians of the Secret of the painting. There's something inside of the painting, some sort of codex or some sort of code that we are not ever going to understand. It's a code that is made up of individualized gestures that cull specifically from Jackson Pollock's life. There's a lot of his biography in this work. He is getting closer and closer. See, it's 1943 yet. By 1947, it's a watershed year. 1943, he's getting closer to this idea of conveying a broader globe, or like a communal psychology, but from his individual perspective. At this point, he's still dealing pretty specifically with his own agenda and his own life. Just a detail of it to show you how it's made. Robert Motherwell, I'm going to go a little fast through these ones because we've got a lot to cover still. Robert Motherwell, this is an early work by him. I'm showing you early work, then we're going to see work from 1947, and then we're going to see later work. Arshio Gorky. Gorky was a European painter like Mata who was working in the later stages of Surrealism in Europe, but then emigrates to the US and brings a certain kind of pictorial stylings with him. Look specifically at the way that he puts these flat pieces of paint on the canvas right here, how they kind of blend together and seep into one another. That's going to be important when we get to the work by a guy named Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko! Here, as I was saying, we have this image that engages with flat planes of color and how they operate, how they blend into one another. This work is teetering towards the work that will develop later, and his work that develops later is pretty signature, and you guys have probably seen some reproduction of it. All right, 1947 gives us Full Fathom 5, which is Jackson Pollock's first ever entirely abstract painting. This painting is chock full of his signature gestures. And his signature gesture was quite literally to stand above the canvas with a heap of paint on a brush and allow very, very tiny, very thin lines to just drizzle over the surface of the canvas. What I can say is this. Seeing Jackson Pollock's work, seeing all of the work that I'm showing you for the entire duration of the semester is hard when you see it digitally over a computer screen. Specifically works like this. So the reason why it's so easy for people to say or to write off works like this as saying that a kid could have done it is because you're not experiencing the thing in person. There is a certain depth to these works that is incredible to encounter in the flesh. To be able to see into these layers of drips and see that there is actually time and deliberate action that is built up through these layers. It's kind of like when you see a piece of the land that's been broken apart and you can see the stratas of the soil layers. That's what looking at this work brings out. And so see these works in person if you are still going to doubt me at the end of this course. So here's Pollock at work. He's just dripping these things around. It does look as though it's chaotic. I can say that when this photographer who took the 4 images on the left and right was in his studio, he was performing for that photographer. The works that he's working on are not seen necessarily as his best works, and quite honestly, I think that it's a little cheesy that he would have allowed himself to fall into such a dumb trap. But he was wildly popular. You know, the bottom line here is he the greatest living painter in the United States is pulled from a Life magazine spread where the top image is also from, where his works became fashionable. This was at a time in America where things like Life magazine were promoting an American lifestyle, and the American lifestyle, the fine art associated with that American lifestyle is Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock worked in a studio, a barn studio, in a town nearby New York City, Long Island, basically. In the kitchen of this place that he lived, his home, was Lee Krasner, who's his wife and fellow artist. Lee Krasner's signature gesture were these little loops that she would make over and over and over again. Lee Krasner is the reason why Jackson Pollock knew Hans Hofmann. Excuse me. She was one of his students at the Art Students League in New York City. She introduced the two. She introduced Pollock to Hofmann's work. Pollock saw Hofmann's drips. Pollock then appropriated those drips and began doing it himself. Japanese sculptor Isamu Noguchi emigrated to the United States, and the thing I want to show you with this image specifically is, so Pollock dripped, Krasner made little squiggles. Noguchi made these gestural marks, but made them in 3 dimensions. And so he's not necessarily a painter, he's very much a sculptor, but they're dealing with the same ideas. David Smith, The Royal Bird. I think it's a little easy that you can read this as a bird, and in an era rife with abstraction, some people think it's a good thing that we have these representational works. I think they're a little cartoonish, but that's just me. Clifford Still, this is what a lot of his works look like. So they're very, very flat, they're roughly abstracted, and they always embody a certain limited palette. In 1947, that palette included primary colors of yellow, red, and blue, and 2 non-colors, the 2 non-colors of black and white. Minor White is a wonderful photographer who in 1948 gives us an image that harkens a little bit back to the ideas that Rothko put out, where there's these blending stratospheres of reality, where white is very clearly, we have sky, we have horizon line, we have water, but in between those areas, there's a lot of gray space, and you don't quite know where the sky ends and where the sea begins. I just love Philip Guston, so I want to throw this in there. This is what he was doing in 1948. I'm going to show you later works by Guston, but it's good for me to situate him in this timeline. A lot of these painters were developing in lower Manhattan in the late 1940s and early 1950s, specifically the late 1940s, quite honestly. Guston was in St. Louis, and so even though he would later move to New York and become part of this milieu, he was not there when the rest of the guys were there. He kind of comes a bit late to the game. Barnett Newman, his signature gesture is very simple. It's called a zip. And it's one line that is painted from top to bottom of the canvas. There are canvases that employ several of these zips, but generally speaking, this one really is quintessentially Newman because it has a zip that's roughly in the center that displays a certain air of painterliness in its like blocky, blotchy color, but it also has a nice way of cutting the canvas straight down the middle, but also elongating the canvas by stopping not until it's actually off the picture's edge. So this is the later Mark Rothko. This is what I think Minor White is more similar to, where like we understand where the pink ends, we understand where the yellow starts, we understand that the black line is the horizon, but when seeing this in person, there's much more of a flow between all three of those things, in the same way that Minor White's photographs operated that way. Adolf Gottlieb, he, like Noguchi, makes these kind of squiggly marks, but where Noguchi would sculpt them in three-dimensional form, Gottlieb made these interesting little boxes, almost like a shadow box or a curio cabinet, and he put them in there. And as part of a conversation about the development of these little individual gestures, I think it's important that we look at someone who's taking a much more analytical approach to that study. Willem de Kooning. De Kooning would become the most famous painter in the United States. Jackson Pollock is going to die in the middle of the 1950s. And after his death, de Kooning is basically the titan of American art. And it begins with works like this. So de Kooning's signature gesture, quite honestly, is painting, ripping away, repainting, ripping away, repainting, ripping away. And I think that a lot of people identified with that psychology, given that we had just ripped away our culture in the First World War, only to rebuild it, and then subsequently rip it away again in the Second World War, only to then attempt to rebuild it. Excavation is one of his first quote-unquote mature works. It comes from 1950, so he's a little younger than a lot of the other guys at bat, but they're all part of the same group. And this work is designed to be specifically abstract, although there are little moments in there that can be seen as worldly or recognizable. It's much easier to see those recognizable things in person, and quite honestly, I have not found good enough, adequate enough details of the work to show you any of that stuff. So, take my word for it. Aaron Siskins, Peeling Paint from 1950. Conceptually, sure, it deals with the ideas put forth by de Kooning and this idea of paint ripping away and being put back on and ripping away and put back on. Siskin, who's a photographer, I think, however, aesthetically aligns much more with Clifford Still, who's gesturally abstracted, swatches of paint actually looked like ripped sheets of paper that have been collaged together. Siskin's photograph here does the same. Harry Callahan gives us this field of leaves that looks a lot like Willem de Kooning's excavation, given that there's this dense massing of positive and negative locations in the film. There's a lot of really bright points on the tops of the leaves, but they're right next to a lot of really dark points where the leaves are not hitting the sunlight, or the sun is not hitting the leaves. So there's this, in the same way that de Kooning had this kind of chaotic, frenetic mass of information, Callahan follows in suit. 1951, Ellsworth Kelly's Colors for a Large Wall. This painting I saw when I was 14 years old in a large retrospective of Ellsworth Kelly's work, and this is what I was saying earlier when I was talking about Hans Hofmann and the 3-year-old could have done it question. It's really easy to look at a work like this and say, duh, right? It's like a bunch of patches of color that make up this grid. How this actually works is there are 64 individual panels that are painted an individual color, and then they are amassed together in one big painting, this painting. But instead of saying, wow, that's dumb, and walking away from it, because of where I saw it in a venerated art institution, I wanted to know why it mattered. And that's what I'm asking for you to do. I'm not telling you that you're wrong for thinking that it looks easy or quick when looking at a drip painting. But what I want you to do instead is say, why does that matter? Why is this important? Why is this in a college class? Why was this painting hanging on the walls of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City in 1996? And it's those questions that are actually the reason why you're in this class, and that's why I'm talking to you for so long. So I was right there with you, and I'm here to get you through, right? All right. It is not surprising that in 1947 Eduardo Palazzi would have just come across an image of a lady seated, because pretty ladies in magazines were really the only thing that magazines were successfully publishing in the day. Pin-ups, as they were. Pin-ups, or the culture of pin-up turned into the culture of the model, and de Kooning was really interested in the amount of images that we were producing of women in almost the exact same setting. You had beautiful women sitting down selling you things. And so he began to make a variety of paintings that started in 1940 and would continue for a very, very long time about the relationship of the female sitter to the person who is not only making the image, but also the person who is then subsequently going to see that image. So a lot of people look at woman one, which is on the right, and say, he's such a misogynist. He made a pretty lady look crazy and mean and gross. And yeah, he did, but the reality of using women as a way of selling things is kind of gross. Like, why can't we just buy the thing? Why do we have to buy this perception of sex and the thing? And that was part of the conversation de Kooning was trying to get at. Woman One is regarded as one of his masterworks. So it's a very important piece. I love when there are moments where you find one painter doing the exact same thing as another painter. And Jack Twerkov, who was working in New York, he was also working in Provincetown. He knew Hans Hofmann, Lee Krasner, probably knew Jackson Pollock, though I'm not sure about that. knew Willem de Kooning was making works like this. Seated figure. See, Tworkov was much more interested in the idea of a sitter, just in general, whereas de Kooning had a very, very pointed thesis behind his work. That is the reason why de Kooning's work is more famous, because it had much more to say. Tworkov was really much more of the Greenbergian painter. He was interested in how images were built. 1951, we get this dude, Robert Rauschenberg. He's a student at Black Mountain College, and he made a four-panel white painting. He did actually a series of white paintings. A lot of painters do, and that's like a graduate level course discussion, so I'm going to save you on that. But really quickly, what I can say with this white painting is the reason why, that's what I can tell you. So, these paintings are not meant to just be four white things on the wall in the same way that Ellsworth Kelly's paintings were just quite literally about colored blocks on the wall. Instead, like Edoardo Palazzi's interest in having artwork reflect the realities of the world around them through the use of imagery, Rauschenberg is also interested in that relationship. But instead of finding advertising material, which actually he will do after he graduates from Black Mountain College and moves to New York and becomes a venerated artist, but first he's much more interested in the way that the audience relates to the work of art. And so the work here, this work, is actually not completed until a person is standing before it, because these four white paintings are meant to be screens where our shadows, the viewer's shadows, are reflected onto them or projected onto them. And so we complete this painting in the same way that a cultural understanding of what Edoardo Palazzi was putting together in I Was a Rich Man's Plaything relies on the audience knowing. It relies on the audience being there and being present. This work also relies on the audience being present. Not just physically there, but thinking about it, critically there. A thing that I find hilarious is that, I'll get to the hilarious thing in just a second. John Cage is a composer, and in 1952, after teaching Robert Rauschenberg at Black Mountain College and being in a lot of conversations with Robert Rauschenberg, he made a piece of music that is referred to as 4 minutes 33 seconds. This is pianist David Tudor performing that work. Now this might be hard to swallow for some of you. It might make some of you laugh. I hope somewhere in between there you'll remember it. Well, you're all going to remember it because it's of what it is. So the performance started in 1952 with David Tudor walking out to the piano, sitting down, opening the keys up, or exposing the keys, lifting that little lid on the piano up, and then he puts his hands on his knees and sits there. And after 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he closes the piano, he stands up, and he walks off stage. And the musical piece is complete. Like Rauschenberg's white paintings, Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds is not meant to be a tongue-in-cheek joke. It's deliberately meant for the audience to become aware of the sounds that are going on around them. It's deliberately timed at 4 minutes 33 seconds around the time of, say, a pop song, so that people will sit in their seats for a long duration of time and wonder why it's silent. And then they start hearing other things around them. They hear people shuffling their feet, they hear people jingling change, coughing, talking. People were very angry at this performance and they were wondering what the hell was going on. All of this stuff was actually part of the work. So in the same way that Rauschenberg needed the audience to be present, Cage needed the audience to be present. Here's a late color field abstraction by Ad Reinhardt. Here's a late work by Robert Motherwell. This lecture is already a little too long, so here's a Philip Guston. So Guston made that Tormentors painting that I showed you a few minutes ago, and he then moved from St. Louis to New York City and began working, and when he got there he began making works like this, that were abstract, that were a very individualized gesture or system of mark making. All of Guston's paintings from this time period look like this, these kind of clouds of hash marks in the center of a relatively nebulous background. Cy Twombly made a variety of different white paintings, and what he would do as the paint was drying is he would go in with crayon, pencil, or some other drawing medium and actually just incise the actual paint itself. And then I want to end with Franz Kline, because this conversation started with Pierre Soulages. Pierre Soulages, at the exact same time, was in Paris making works that looked a lot like this. Pierre Soulages was interested in a certain kind of venerated material, so he used walnut stain. Whereas Kline was much more interested in the brushiness and bulkiness of paint, and so he used paint. Now the way Kline worked is he would make all these little doodles on a sheet of paper and then project them onto a wall. And so if we were talking about signature gestures, this is Kline literally magnifying his doodling gesture. A doodle is so individualized that none of your doodles will ever look like anyone else's doodles. And he projects them on a wall and then makes these big, heroic, we, America, are the reason why the Second World War ended. We, America, are the people that are going to continue the avant-garde. We, America, have made a new kind of painting, and it's called abstract expressionism. We, America, are New York, New York. So this painting really does finish this lecture wonderfully by just saying, New York is where it happened, New York was responsible for it, New York, New York, New York. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye from New York and wish you all a good day.